few days ago, the Wall Street Journal had a really interesting event you may have missed. It was called the Tech Health Conference. During that event, one reporter had a question for the head of Google's health division, a man called David Feinberg. Why, that reporter asked, was Google censoring searches for information about the possibility that COVID had in fact escaped from a laboratory in China? Feinberg began by admitting the premise of the question. Yes, Google was in fact hiding information from its users, he effectively conceded, but it was for their own good. According to Feinberg, Google didn't want to, quote, lead people down pathways that we would not find to be authoritative information. Authoritative information. You've heard that phrase a lot in the last year, or phrases like it. Authoritative information is the opposite of misinformation or disinformation, or worse, a conspiracy theory. It's really important. All you're allowed to see is authoritative information. So it is worth knowing, in this and many other cases, what is it? And in this case, where did Google get its so-called authoritative information? Well, in this case, it got that information from a group led by a noted man of science called Peter Daszak. If the name sounds familiar, Peter Daszak is the person who almost single-handedly stopped all public speculation about the lab leak early in the pandemic last year. Daszak did this in one swoop by organizing a letter to The Lancet, that's one of the top scientific publications in all of science, stating as a known fact that there was no possibility this virus, the coronavirus, COVID-19, could have come from a lab in Wuhan. There was no chance. Well, many people believed him and they stopped looking. It was in The Lancet, after all. Almost no one asked, unfortunately, why Peter Daszak particularly might be saying this. And of course, we now know the answer. Peter Daszak himself was funding research on bat coronaviruses in Wuhan. And he was doing that using American tax dollars supplied to him by Tony Fauci. According to one grant that Fauci approved, Daszak was authorized to conduct, quote, virus infection experiments across a range of cell cultures from different species and humanized mice. Why humanized mice? Well, because they mimic human beings. Daszak and his collaborators wanted to make viruses more infectious to people. He didn't hide this. In December of 2019, Daszak appeared on a podcast on YouTube, which is owned by Google, by the way, to brag about how easy it is in the lab to manipulate bat coronaviruses.
Coronaviruses are pretty good. I mean, you're a virologist, you know all this stuff, but you can manipulate them in the lab pretty easily. It's just spike protein drives a lot of what happens with the coronavirus. So you can get the sequence, you can build the protein, and we work with Ralph Barrick at UNC to do this. Insert it into the backbone of another virus and do some work in the lab.
So really, in one of the great kind of head-hitting moments in recent history, we learn that the guy directly tied to bat virus experiments in the lab in Wuhan was the very same guy telling the entire world that there was no possibility this virus could have come from the Wuhan lab. Conflict of interest, anyone? It's absurd. It's beyond belief. What's amazing is that Google knew this. The evidence was right there on one of its own platforms, YouTube, which it owns. So why did Google continue to rely on Peter Daszak, of all people on Earth, to decide what the rest of the population could know about the origins of COVID? That is the answer. Tonight we know why. It turns out that Tony Fauci was not the only one funding Peter Daszak's research on bat viruses. Google was funding that research too. It sounds unlikely, but we know it. We know this from a new piece in the National Pulse, which just published the evidence. And here's the evidence. Peter Daszak admitted it in print. We don't need to speculate. It's right there. Beginning in 2010, several of Daszak's research papers explicitly acknowledged that they were funded by Google. One of those papers was an observational study that analyzed the transmission of viruses from bats to humans, in this case in Bangladesh. Quote, proximity of bats to human populations may facilitate the transmission of viruses either through direct contact or through foodborne routes. A decade later, Google was still paying him. In this case, Google paid Peter Daszak to take his study of bat viruses to Guangdong province in China, home of the now famous bat caves. While there, Daszak used Google's money to study the, quote, perceptions associated with transmission of pathogens with pandemic potential in highly exposed human populations at the animal-human interface, end quote. So yes, Peter Daszak knows an awful lot about bat-borne pandemics. In fact, it seems likely he is implicated in one, and Google is likely implicated in it as well. So together, Google and Daszak work to keep critical, factual information from the public, as nearly 4 million people from around the world died from the virus. It's a horrible story, and someday, perhaps soon, we will learn all of it.